How's it? I'm back again. Sorry about the last video. It was a bit dark and quiet. My microphone on the wrong setting. Forgot. Didn't have my lamp on. Just getting back into it. Alright, so here is chapter 8. The Dignified. Integrity is doing the right thing even if nobody is watching. Jim Stovall. My friend promised me that if I made it to Lubumbashi in Zaire, he would take me out into the bush. This was one way to make sure I came to visit him. I borrowed an old Renault 10 with bald tires and started out to Zaire. It was 1976, and Rhodesia and Zambia were not on friendly terms. This was during the Bush War, and Zambia was harboring Rhodesian insurgents. Insurgent terrorists. Mugabe and his folks were in Mugabe by this time Mugabe would have been in Mozambique. Mugabe was in Mozambique. It would have been, what's the other guy's name? Anyway, it would have been Zapu. Zapu was in Zambia. Anyway, never mind. From the Victoria Falls, I drove into Botswana at Kazungula, clearing customs and immigration twice within 300 meters. In departing Botswana, the customs officials started to shout at me for walking on the grass. Totally bewildered, I was led outside and shown a sign that read, Keep off your feet from this grass." All I could see was sand and a few goat droppings. I suppose I could have shown more control, but I laughed until I cried. It reminded me of a sign in Wanky Game Reserve that says, "Toilet, stay in your car." Customs and immigration were not amused, but stamped my passport, and I left still laughing, tears rolling down my cheeks. Africa. I drove onto the ferry that takes us across the Zambezi to Zambia, and struck up a conversation with an old man who had been in the office when the customs officials had shouted at me. He was very disturbed at how disrespectful people had become. He was going to Kabwe to visit his son, who had posted him money for the journey. It was a hot day, but the old gentleman was dressed in a three-piece suit, jersey, a hat, and a small travelling case. That's the thing about the older generation of blacks in Africa, especially Zimbabwe. It's like they are so much more respectful and respectable than the new generations. I mean, maybe that's everywhere. But I remember when I was in paramedics and I attended to this one guy in the townships, older gentleman who had broken his arm. And so we splintered the arm, and we said, alright, we have to take you to Harare, to the capital, to hospital to get the arm reset. And he said, okay, but please help me to put on my suit. He refused. He absolutely refused to go until he was wearing he would not go to town until he was wearing his three-piece suit. Well, not three-piece, two-piece, you know. He wanted a nice shirt. He wanted his trousers, his slacks, and he wanted his coat. Obviously, couldn't put it on fully because of the arm was splintered and in a sling. But yeah, he wouldn't go to town without his suit. I've seen them. They will ride in the minibuses, you know, crowded, hot. I've even seen them riding a bicycle, you know, in the middle of the day, hot as hell, and they're still in their full suit. They will not go to town underdressed. And I think that's something we need to start emulating, start doing again. You know, before you go out, if you're going out to town, you know, dress up a little bit. Don't go out in your pajamas, man. Come on. There's a little tangent. We had been together only a few minutes, and I already felt that I had known this old man for many years already, offering to take him with me as I was passing Kabwe on my way to Zaire. This pleased him no end, and all of his worries seemed to lift. He told me where he lived, of his 3 wives, his 22 children, what they ate, what he had done for most of his life, and all the places he had worked. The ferry ground to a halt on the Zambian side, and the two of us drove up to the customs and immigration house. It was nothing but a square of cement blocks. The old man went first, explaining that he was going to visit his son. With much shouting and abuse, the immigration officer wrote out a prohibited immigrant's form and verbally chased my friend out of the office. Then he did the same to me, making me a prohibited immigrant. But I could not afford to let this happen, as I might miss a trip to the bush if I couldn't get to Zaire. I have always been a believer in the KISS principle that says, keep it simple, stupid. In other words, use something that has been tried and tested. In my bag, I've always carried something to continue my studies, to continue my scientific studies of levitation. On this occasion, I had a small tin with sweets painted all over the outside, and the tin rattled a bit. After the immigration had made me a prohibited immigrant, I took out my tin of sweets and offered him one. "I don't want a sweet," he shouted at me. "I'm going to stand here all day until you take a sweet, sir. I am a visitor to your country, and it is only proper that I give you a small token before I leave. I insist, sir. Please, have a sweet." He was sitting behind his desk, staring at me, and put out his hand. I put the tin in his hand, and he unscrewed the top. Out of the tin sprang something that looked like a python. It was only a spring covered in a python-covered cloth, but the effects were immensely satisfying. From a sitting position, the man levitated right over the desk, knocking me out of the way and disappearing. With one swift move, I opened the drawer where he kept all the prohibited immigrant papers, picked them up, put them in my shirt, and walked out into the bright sunshine. By this time I had hidden the tin in my bag and waved goodbye to the stunned immigration officer. The old man was waiting near my car, and I motioned for him to get in. We drove back onto the ferry and waited for it to start across the Zambezi to Botswana. We sat in silence with our back against the rails, and as soon as we were out into the current, I pulled out all the papers, made paper boats, throwing them overboard. When I came to the old man's paper, I read his name, made another paper boat, and threw it overboard with mine. He suddenly realized what I was doing and said, "Tomorrow there will be another officer in charge, and I can go and visit my son," he said with a smile on his face, and then turned to me. "How did you get the papers? You must come to my village and stay with me." He wasn't interested in how I got the papers. We watched the long line of small paper boats floating down the Zambezi with clumps of floating cabbage weed, all destined to eventually go over the Victoria Falls. Back at his village, food was prepared. I sat in the shade of a mango tree while Back at his village, food was ordered. I sat in the shade of a mango tree while rice was prepared. I was given a large bowl of steaming rice, and a dish of bubbling fish was brought out. With my fingers I reached for a piece of fish after the old man had taken his piece. It was barbel, or catfish, that had been sitting for so long it had fermented. This was the way the Lozi ate barbel. A whole new experience for me. It's like the Scandinavians. They eat that fermented shark, I think. Ugh, disgusting. The smell was astounding. I never imagined any food could smell so bad. And I have to admit, I've eaten just about everything. But this was the smelliest food I had ever eaten. Even after dropping the old man off 2 days later in Kabwe, my breath was still smelly. I slept on a reed mat that night in a hut all to myself, with a fire smouldering in the middle of the floor to keep the mosquitoes away. The next day, we had a friendly immigration officer who treated both of us very well, and we were on our way early. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, we were in Kabwe. The old man stood next to my car, travelling bag in one hand, his hat against his heart. You have shown me respect, my son, and I give you my blessing. May our God be with you." He turned, put on his hat, and walked off down the street with the slow, measured steps. It was the best blessing anyone could have given me. That's what I'm saying, it's like the older generation, there's just something there that's been lost. The new generation is all like backbiters and cutthroats, and everyone's just out to look after themselves, Okay. The tires on the Renault had finally given out. The canvas was showing on all 4 tires, and it was only a matter of time before they started to burst. I was in dire straits. I stopped at a garage in Kitwe and looked around for someone to talk to. There was no one, so I just sat down and had the cleaner make me a cup of tea. Finally, a man came in looking quite distressed. He had a lump in his cheek, and I thought this was my lucky day. I had brought all of my jungle tooth-pulling gear along with me, and knew that this man was suffering from a toothache. "Excuse me, sir. Are you suffering from a toothache?" "Damn straight I am. I drove all the way to Lusaka to have it pulled, and they say I have to fly to Joburg to a specialist," he fumed. "I can pull it for you, sir. Pulling is my speciality," I announced. He stood there stunned, looking at this red-bearded chap from Rhodesia with no shoes. "I'll trade you 4 tires for my Renault for pulling your tooth, sir, if that's all right, as I have no money to purchase the tires I need." "Well, I don't know if I can trust you or not, but you might as well have a go. If you can't pull it, no tires. Understood?" I understood completely. "And it's the right one at the back. The wisdom tooth, I think they call it." I gave him the anesthetic while he was seated at his desk. And then while the anesthetic took effect, we grubbed around in his yard for some tires. Luckily, there was another Renault 10 sitting there with a burnt-out engine and 4 brand new Michelin tires. I saw the man pulling at his numb lip, so I knew he was totally anesthetized. I took him back to the desk, took one of my small elevators, and elevated that wisdom tooth. It was solid as a rock. No wonder the chap in Lusaka referred it. I then took out a huge rubber bite block and pushed it in between the teeth on the opposite side. Told him to bite on that great gobstopper, and took a pair of forceps that looked like cow horns and clamped down on his tooth. I kept squeezing on the tooth, knowing that the pressure of the curved tips would be loosening the tooth and also forcing it up. I held it like that for about 20 minutes, the whole time just talking a lot of nonsense to my patient. Suddenly the whole tooth just lifted out, and I took it and put it on the table. It had 4 roots, hence the solid rock effect, and they were all curved. I put a gauze plug in the man's mouth and had him bite on it. He cleaned off the tooth and kept looking at it and then at me. "I didn't even feel a thing," he kept saying through his closed mouth. Then he yelled for his mechanics to put the tires on my car. When I tell people of this incident, people always say how lucky I was to have found a patient at the right time. I like to think that maybe the blessing of the old man was coming true. You know what? I'm with him. I mean, the fact that he found a guy who needed his help and who had what Bill needed at that exact moment when he needed it. That's just God's hand. That's just God's blessing. My brother sent me to a client who after the 6 weeks on safari with me turned out to be a great friend and still is today. I sold my precious Land Cruiser and for $400 Zim bought Zephaniah's old green Land Rover, the ultimate beast. Don watched in amazement as I took a tin of condensed milk and mended the cracked manifold. It was already almost red hot. And all I did was pour the condensed milk onto the crack, where it formed a hard caramel, which lasted until I sold it. I put white pepper in the radiator to stop a leak. The gearbox was leaking so badly that I eventually had to use cooking oil until I could get to Kariba and have a seal put in. During all of the fixing, we were slowly making our way up the valley from Mukumbura to Mana Pools. For Don, it was the adventure of a lifetime, experiencing things that a person from another continent can't even imagine. Oh yeah, that's always the best. That's the thing, is that, like your trips to the bush, the ones where nothing goes wrong, the smooth ones, the easy ones, you forget about them. It's the ones where there's trouble, where you suffer, where something goes wrong and you have to sort it. Those are the ones you remember. Those are the most memorable times in your life. My brother Steve had warned Don about me and the elephants. Don't you let him take you close to those elephants, warned Steve. But the temptation. But the temptation was too great for Don. Take me up close to that old bull, Bill, so I can get a good picture with my sure shot camera, he begged. I looked the situation over, seeing a clump of mahoganies growing out of an anthill 40 meters from the elephant. The bull was also down in the water next to a bank 2 meters high. I knew the elephant by the old scars on the top of his head, and had named him Solomon because of his apparent wisdom. Hunters had shot him above the brain in the honeycomb of his skull, leaving him in good health, but very cranky with the species Homo sapiens horribilis. He was a very dignified old bull, which gave people a false sense of security, and they would come beyond the safe zone in their vehicles. Next thing, there would be screams and orders to the driver to get the hell out of there. The whole time, our dignified bull bearing down on them. That's the thing that foreigners don't understand, is because the elephants look really peaceful, and calm. And it's only when you push them too far, when you get too close, then things can take a turn for the worst. Alright, listen. We're going to creep up to the bull on our hands and knees, then lay on our bellies for the last 5 yards. If he comes up the bank, we roll towards that hill. Then you get up and run like hell. Roll towards that anthill. Then you get up and run like hell. You got that? I asked. You reckon you can run faster than me? Don queried. I know I can. Old and fat makes no difference when you have adrenaline coursing through your veins. Don was already smiling. You could almost say he was looking forward to this exercise. How do you know he's going to chase you? Oh, believe me, I know, I said, remembering previous incidents. We crept up to the old bull and lay there watching him for about 10 minutes while he ate the succulent grasses that grew on the water's edge. Then Don took his small camera and snapped the picture. In an instant, the bull spun around and came up the bank to the side of us where it formed a small slide. We both rolled, and Don got up running. I jumped towards the bull and threw my hat at him, shouting at the same time. He stopped for a second, backed up a step, and then came on like a freight train. I got it to the anthill the same time Don did, with the elephant right on our heels. We both slid around the anthill, and the elephant pushed his trunk right through the trees, trying to grab me. I kept just out of reach with the tips of his trunk barely inches from my nose. Don was hanging onto my belt, ready to run around the other side should the elephant come to our side. With great dignity, the old bull backed up, swung his front foot a couple times, gathered a small pile of dust, scooped it up with his trunk, and tossed it over his back. He walked off towards a grove of acacias as though nothing had happened, and the attitude that he was too great to mess with the likes of us. Alright. That's it for tonight. Man, I love the bush. I can't wait to go back. Studying elephants. That would be pretty great. I'm not gonna lie. I'll see if I can get into that in Wangi. Studying some of the elephants there. Anyway, thanks for listening, and check you tomorrow. Sleep well. Cheers.